Hello, friend. Welcome to the Church Finance and Minister Tax Podcast. My name is Michelle Brown, and I'm honored to be your host. In this podcast, we will discuss topics to help you organize, maximize, and utilize your God-given talents and skills so you can do what you do best, which is take care of the business side of the church and do it with excellence. If you are a church secretary, bookkeeper, administrative assistant, or any other superpower title you've been given, then this podcast is for you. So grab your notebook and pen, my friend, and your favorite beverage, and let's get ready to learn something cool today. Hello, and welcome to episode 75 of the podcast. We all know why we're here, so let's dive right on in. Back on July 31st, which was just a couple weeks ago, I had the privilege of spending 5 hours in my own training with Mr. Frank Somerville and Elaine Somerville. If you are familiar with those names, Elaine is a CPA and wrote the book Church Compensation for Churches, and or staff compensation, and Frank is an attorney and CPA who works and writes for Church Law and Tax as well as the Church Network. So these are my gurus, my go-to, where I get my training in all things church finances and minister taxes, okay? Like I said, we spent 5 hours together back on the 31st, and I just wanted to share with you some of the information that we went over because we covered employment law updates and how they pertain to the churches. We covered a lot, actually, in our time together, but I thought that this was really important and that you all needed to be made aware of this. Here is my disclaimer, though. I am not an attorney. I am not providing legal advice here. I am simply telling you what I learned so far about the new rule that's going into effect. You ready? Cool. The first thing we went over was employment law updates. As of March of this year, there are new regulations for the definition of employees, and they actually have 17 different definitions of what constitute an employee, which is insane, which is why so many people are confused, all right? The Department of Labor's definition is different than that of some other definitions, and the IRS's definition of an employee does not always match the Department of Labor's definition of an employee, which is beyond frustrating. It's like, people, can you not work together? Anyways, the FLSA, which is the Fair Labor Standards Act, uses an economic reality test to determine whether someone is an employee or an independent contractor. Most churches use the ABC test, and I'm going to go over what exactly the ABC test is and why this matters. The ABC test means what the actions of the individual are, what the behaviors of the individual are, and if the individual is central to operations. So A is actions, B is behavior, C is the centrality to the operations, all right? Depending on the answers to those questions, that determines who is an employee versus an independent contractor. And why is this important? Because the classification of an individual as an employee or an independent contractor carries significant consequences for all parties involved. If you are classified as an independent contractor, then you are not covered by the FLSA laws such as wage and hour rules, anti-discrimination laws, and other rules. Also, if you are classified as an independent contractor, you do not receive unemployment benefits when you lose a job. You do not receive workers' compensation when injured on the job, and you are fully responsible for the payroll tax contribution to the Social Security and Medicare programs. All right. So, and that's where ministers have that dual tax status, where they're considered an employee for common law purposes, but self-employed for income tax purposes, okay? So they have to pay those full taxes there. So I have run across pastors who say, and they want to be taxed as an independent contractor, but if you go through this ABC test, you're like, okay, what are the actions? Who controls most of what the pastor does? Well, the pastor says, I write my own sermons. I do this, I do that. But I can almost guarantee you that if your pastor gets up there and you are a very, say, conservative church, and you start speaking in tongues, or using one of the more modern Bible translations, or you're preaching anything that does not align with that denomination's teachings, the church is going to say, you can't preach that. The church is going to have the right to fire you, to dismiss you, okay? They have the right to exercise control over that pastor. Therefore, he doesn't pass that test, all right? He is an employee for the purposes, all right? Test number 2 is the B, which is your behavior. So if your church tells you that you need to be there on Sunday mornings to preach the sermon, or that you need to be there for practice, or you're a musician, you need to be there for rehearsal, or you need to dress a certain way as a church employee, etc., okay? The amount of behavioral control that a church has determines whether or not the individual is an independent contractor or an employee. And then the number 3, the C, the big thing, which is going to make every pastor an employee and not an independent contractor, is whether the individual and the service they provide are central to the operations of the church. Seriously, I would dare say that every pastor is central to the operations of the church, okay? So that's why I don't care what brouhaha you give me. If you are a pastor of a church and that is your weekly dedicated work, okay, you are an employee. You are not an independent contractor. Now, if you are a visiting pastor, or you are a traveling minister, or you are let's say an interim for, you're just going to be there for a month or two, then absolutely, you can be considered a independent contractor. But for the most part, I would say at least 95% of the time, you are going to be an employee, all right? So 24 states across the U.S. have implemented and adopted this ABC test to determine who is an employee versus an independent contractor. And again, this doesn't apply just to ministers. This applies to, I get the same arguments with musicians, with the organ player, with child care workers, okay? Go with that ABC test. So that's a little bit about the background of the labor law. Now, one of the big updates with labor laws this year is the new minimum threshold for someone to be on salary. And here's the new rule. Effective July 1st of this year, so just last month, the salary threshold increased to the equivalent of an annual salary of $43,888 a year, or $844 a week. Okay? It was before July 1st, you only had to do $684 a week. Now it is $844 a week. And come January 1st of 2025, it's going to increase again to $1,128 a week, or $58,656 a week. That's whether you're part-time, full-time, it doesn't matter. That is the new minimum threshold for someone to be on salary. So here's a reminder that FLSA rules do not apply to ministers due to the ministerial exception. Really briefly here, the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution gives churches a constitutional exemption from the application of employment laws to ministers. This exemption does not extend to employees who are not ministers. If an employee is a minister, the exemption applies, and it prevents ministers from suing the church for employment grievances such as discrimination, pay, or overtime hours, okay? So if your particular denomination does not allow women to be pastors of the church, then a woman applying for a pastor position at your church cannot sue your church for discrimination because you wouldn't hire her because she's a woman. Okay. Now, that does not hold true if they're a regular employee. Okay. This only applies to ministers. So, however, most church employees don't qualify for the ministerial exception. Your church treasurer, your church bookkeeper, the church janitor, all do not qualify for that. I do know a lot of church secretaries that are on salary. Well, that's fine if you're going to pay them at least $844 a week, okay, or $1,128 a week come January. If not, then the church has to pay them overtime. And that's what this whole thing means, is that if you've got somebody on salary and they do not meet this ministerial exemption, and you are not paying them bare minimum right now to the end of the year, $844 a week, then they still have to fill out a timesheet. They still have to track their hours. If they go over 40 hours, you still have to pay them time and a half or overtime. And you still must meet the minimum wage requirements. Okay? To me, I don't understand, why do you put someone on salary if you're just going to track all this anyways, but you do what you do, okay? It's just, if you're at least $844 a week, they don't get the overtime, they don't have to track the hours, you don't have this, okay? But if they're less than $844 a week, you still have to do all this other stuff. So the takeaway from this is that the IRS's guidelines and the Department of Labor are two separate entities. They have two separate guidelines, which is frustrating to your non-exempt employees, which is going to be everybody who doesn't meet the ministerial exemption. All right. They are required by law to keep timesheets. You have to pay them at least minimum wage, and you have to pay them overtime. And the new salary requirements are now in effect. And I know that's enough to think about, but you need to look at who you've got on salary right now. Are they meeting this new $844 a week, or do you need to take some of your salary people and put them back on hourly pay? Okay, and then if so, you need to make sure they're filling out those timesheets and that you're meeting all these other requirements. There are other things that we talked about in this meeting, but this is enough for today. So we're just going to wrap that up from there. I do thank you for sharing your time with me today. And as always, let's strive to make an impact and not just an income. And remember to always look your best, do your best, and be your best. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening today. If you haven't joined my free Facebook community yet, check it out at facebook.com/groups/church bookkeeping and clergy tax. The link is also in the show notes. And please know that no matter what is going on in your part of the world, God's got you. Be blessed, my friend. Bye-bye.